My name is Elena Hart, and I never thought the people who raised me would one day become strangers, sitting across a table from me pretending I didn't exist. Everything started the day I returned to my childhood home after 5 years of building a life in another city. I had come back only because of my grandmother's inheritance reading. She was the only person in my family who ever made me feel seen, and before she passed away, she left something behind that my parents never expected me to receive. They had already built their plans around controlling everything she owned, but what they didn't know was that she had left a final document, one that was never meant to be found until the right moment. When I walked into the house that day, the air felt different. It was too quiet, too controlled, like everything inside had been rearranged to hide something. My mother greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and my father avoided looking at me directly. They told me the inheritance process had already been handled, that everything had been distributed according to family agreement. Those words didn't sit right with me because there had never been any agreement I was part of. I asked to see the documents, and that was the first time I noticed the hesitation in their voices. My mother placed a folder on the table and said everything I needed was inside. I opened it slowly, expecting to see legal papers, signatures, something official. But what I saw instead was incomplete paperwork, pages missing, and signatures that looked forced or duplicated. My father said it was all standard procedure and that I should be grateful I was included at all. That sentence stayed with me because it didn't sound like inclusion, it sounded like erasure. I didn't argue. I just studied every page carefully, memorizing every detail. Something felt off in the way the documents were arranged, like they were meant to convince me rather than inform me. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandmother's voice when she once told me, "Never trust a paper you didn't see being written." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant, but now it felt like she had been warning me. The next morning, I went to the legal office that had supposedly processed everything. The clerk looked confused when I mentioned my name. He checked the records twice and told me there was no complete file under my authorization. He said only partial transfers had been recorded, and even those required additional verification. My stomach tightened when I realized what that meant. If the official office had no record of full transfer, then the documents my parents showed me were not the complete truth. When I returned home, I noticed something new. A locked drawer in my father's study that I had never seen before. I waited until late evening when the house was quiet. My parents were in the living room watching television, thinking I had already accepted their version of reality. I found a small key hidden inside a bookshelf behind old files. My hands were shaking when I opened the drawer because I didn't know what I would find, but I knew I had to look. Inside was a second set of documents, carefully stored and dated more recently than the ones they showed me. These papers told a different story. My grandmother had left a full inheritance directly to me, bypassing any parental control. There were legal clauses stating that any attempt to alter, suppress, or redistribute the inheritance without my consent would result in immediate investigation and reversal of all transfers. My breath stopped when I realized what I was holding. This was not just missing paperwork. This was the truth they had tried to bury. But there was something else inside the folder that made my hands go cold. A single sealed envelope labeled "Final Authorization Paper," to be presented only by Elena Hart in legal dispute. My name was written in my grandmother's handwriting. It meant she had anticipated this exact situation. She had known someone would try to take what belonged to me before I even knew how to protect it. I didn't open the envelope yet. I needed to understand everything first. Instead, I took photographs of every page and placed everything back exactly as I found it. That night, I sat in my room staring at the ceiling, realizing that my entire return home had not been a reunion. It had been a trap I was stepping into without knowing it. The next day, I confronted my parents again, but this time I was calm. I told them I had spoken to the legal office. I watched their expression shift for just a second before they regained control. My mother laughed softly and said I must have misunderstood something. My father told me I was overthinking and that grief was making me suspicious. But I wasn't grieving. I was observing. What they didn't know was that I had already scheduled a formal review of the inheritance through an independent legal authority, and I had not yet used the final document my grandmother left behind. I was waiting for the right moment, because I wanted them to believe they still controlled the outcome. That belief was the only advantage I had. That evening, as I sat alone in my room, I finally opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a single paper, but it changed everything. It was a legal override clause granting me exclusive authority over the entire estate if any form of manipulation or unauthorized distribution was proven. My grandmother hadn't just left me an inheritance. She had left me a key, a last paper that could undo everything they had done. And at that moment, I realized something even more important. This was no longer about money. It was about truth, control, and the quiet kind of betrayal that only reveals itself when it is already too late for the other side to hide it. I waited until morning before doing anything with the document. The house was unusually still, the kind of stillness that feels rehearsed rather than natural. My mother moved through the kitchen without speaking to me, and my father left early without explanation. It was clear they were avoiding me, or maybe avoiding the possibility that I had already begun to see through them. I kept the sealed paper hidden inside my bag and went out as if I was following my normal routine. But instead of going to work, I went directly to an independent legal consultant across town. The office was small, almost unremarkable, but something about it felt honest. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Marissa Hale, listened carefully as I explained everything. I didn't show emotion while speaking. I had learned that emotion weakens clarity when people are trying to take things from you. When I placed the documents on her desk, she didn't react immediately. She read slowly, page by page, her expression tightening with every line. At one point, she paused and asked me if I was absolutely sure these papers had been kept hidden from me. I told her yes. She leaned back slightly and said something I wasn't expecting. She said this wasn't just a disputed inheritance. It looked like a structured concealment case. The words sounded heavier than they should have. I asked her what that meant, and she explained that in legal terms it meant someone had intentionally manipulated the distribution process while knowing full well it could be reversed later. My grandmother's final clause wasn't just a safety net. It was a trigger designed to expose fraud after execution. I felt something shift inside me when she said that. It wasn't anger yet. It was clarity, like pieces of a puzzle finally aligning in a way that removed all doubt. My parents hadn't just misunderstood the inheritance, they had actively tried to override it. Marissa asked to see the sealed envelope. When I handed it over, she examined the seal carefully and confirmed it had never been opened or tampered with. She told me something important. If what was inside matched the legal structure she was seeing, then I had full authority to initiate a reversal process that would freeze all current distributions immediately. But she also warned me about timing. Once a formal legal reversal was initiated, my parents would be notified within hours. There would be no going back to silence or negotiation. Everything would become official, documented, and confrontational. I left her office with a strange sense of distance from my own life. It felt like I was walking inside a version of my story that had already been written long before I understood the rules. My grandmother had not just anticipated betrayal, she had designed a response to it. When I returned home that evening, I noticed a change in atmosphere immediately. My father was waiting in the living room. Not casually, not relaxed. He was sitting like someone expecting confrontation. My mother stood near the staircase, arms crossed, watching me carefully. My father asked where I had been. His voice was controlled but sharp underneath. I told him I was handling legal matters related to the inheritance. The moment I said that, the silence in the room changed. My mother stepped forward and asked what exactly I meant by handling. I didn't answer directly. I simply said I had reviewed everything. That was enough. My father stood up slowly and told me I was making a mistake, that I was disrupting something already settled. I realized then that in their minds, the situation was already closed. They believed the inheritance belonged to them now, not me. That belief was their weakness. I walked past them and went to my room without arguing. But I knew they were no longer ignoring me. They were preparing. That night I received a message from Marissa. She said the documents had been verified and that the sealed paper contained exactly what she expected. A full legal override clause activated by proof of unauthorized distribution. She told me I needed to decide whether I was ready to proceed, because once it began, everything would unfold quickly. I sat for a long time holding my phone, thinking about my grandmother. She wasn't just leaving me money or property. She was leaving me a correction mechanism for betrayal. And now I had to decide whether I was willing to activate it. The next morning, I noticed something different in my parents' behavior. They were no longer pretending everything was normal. My mother avoided me completely, and my father spent most of the day on phone calls in another room. I could hear his tone shifting between frustration and urgency. They knew something was coming, even if they didn't know exactly what. By afternoon, a man in a formal suit arrived at the house. He introduced himself as a legal representative from the estate processing office. He said there had been a request for review initiated on my behalf. My father immediately turned toward me, his expression tense. My mother looked confused, but there was fear underneath it. I didn't deny it. The representative explained that once a review of this nature was triggered, all current asset distributions would be temporarily frozen until legal verification was complete. My father interrupted him immediately, insisting that everything had already been properly settled and legally approved. But the representative remained calm. He said the existence of a sealed override clause required mandatory investigation. That was the moment everything in the room changed. My mother's face went pale. My father's voice lowered, no longer argumentative, but controlled in a way that felt more dangerous. After the representative left, silence filled the house. Then my father asked me a question I will never forget. He asked if I understood what I had just done. I looked at him and said yes. I understood perfectly. Because now the truth was no longer hidden inside drawers or sealed envelopes. It was already moving forward. The moment the estate review process officially began, the house stopped feeling like a home. It felt like a waiting room for something inevitable. Every sound carried more weight. Every silence felt like it was measuring time. My parents no longer tried to pretend things were normal. They had shifted into a different mode entirely, one that was colder, more calculated. My father stopped speaking to me directly. Instead, he communicated through short instructions to my mother, as if I had become an outsider in a space I grew up in. My mother, on the other hand, began watching me constantly. Not openly, but through small moments when she thought I wouldn't notice. It was the kind of surveillance that didn't need words to feel threatening. 2 days after the legal freeze was issued, I received another call from Marissa Hale. Her voice was steady, but there was something sharper underneath it this time. She told me the investigation had escalated faster than expected because additional irregularities had been discovered in the financial transfers. The partial inheritance records my parents had shown me were not just incomplete. They had been selectively altered. She paused before continuing, as if choosing her words carefully. She said there were multiple layers of transfers routed through accounts that were never disclosed to the estate office. In simple terms, the inheritance had already been quietly redistributed before I ever returned home. My parents had not just taken control of it, they had already begun dispersing it. I sat down while listening to her because standing suddenly felt unnecessary. It wasn't shock anymore. It was recognition. The house, the behavior, the urgency in their silence, all of it now made sense in a way that felt disturbingly clean. Marissa then told me something that changed the direction of everything. She said the sealed override clause I held didn't just freeze assets. It also allowed retroactive reversal of all unauthorized transfers if intentional concealment could be proven. And based on what she was seeing, the evidence threshold was being met faster than expected. But she warned me about something else. The moment reversal began, my parents would not only lose access to the inheritance, they could also become legally exposed for financial misconduct. It would no longer be a private family conflict. It would become a formal case. After the call ended, I stayed in my room for a long time without moving. The weight of what was happening wasn't emotional anymore. It was structural, like watching a system collapse from inside itself. That evening, my father finally spoke to me directly. He knocked on my door and entered without waiting for permission. He didn't sit down. He just stood near the doorway, as if sitting would mean accepting something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. He told me I was being influenced by external pressure, that I was misinterpreting legal language I didn't fully understand. His voice was controlled, but I could hear something breaking underneath it. Not fear exactly. Something closer to losing authority. I asked him one question. I asked him why there were undisclosed accounts linked to my grandmother's estate. He didn't answer immediately. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he said I was mistaken. But the way he said it lacked conviction. It sounded rehearsed, like a line repeated too many times to still hold meaning. When he left the room, I noticed something I hadn't before. His hand was trembling slightly. The next morning, a second legal representative arrived at the house. This time, it wasn't a routine visit. It was formal. He carried documentation that required acknowledgement from all involved parties. My parents were asked to present financial disclosures related to the inheritance. For the first time, my mother didn't speak at all. She simply sat in the living room, staring at the documents without touching them. My father tried to maintain control of the conversation, but his responses were slower now, less precise. The structure he had relied on was no longer stable. The representative explained that failure to provide full disclosure would automatically escalate the case to a higher legal authority. And that escalation would include forensic financial auditing. That word changed everything in the room. My father finally looked at me directly, and this time there was no attempt to hide emotion. He asked me if I was truly prepared for what would happen next. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, I wasn't the one controlling what was happening anymore. I had only opened the door my grandmother had already built. That night, I received access confirmation from Marissa. The reversal process had officially begun. And once it begins, she told me, it does not stop halfway. The next morning, I noticed police presence outside the estate office. It was subtle at first, just one vehicle parked across the street. But by midday, there were more. Something was moving through the system now, something that could no longer be contained within private conversations or family walls. Inside the house, my parents were no longer pretending to maintain control. My mother spent most of the day in her room. My father was on continuous calls, but his tone had changed completely. It was no longer commanding. It was defensive. I overheard part of one conversation where he said, "We didn't think it would escalate this far." That sentence stayed with me because it was the first time he acknowledged the situation had its own direction now. Later that afternoon, Marissa called again. This time her voice was quieter. She told me something unexpected had been discovered during the preliminary audit. My grandmother had not only structured the inheritance carefully, she had documented a pattern of interference attempts even before her death. There were written notes, time-stamped and legally witnessed, indicating she suspected manipulation from within the family long before any official proceedings began. In those notes, she had named no one directly, but the implications were clear. She had been preparing for this outcome from the beginning. When I hung up the phone, I realized something that made everything feel different. This was no longer about what my parents had taken. It was about what my grandmother had predicted they would try to take, and she had already built the final response before they even made their move. The legal escalation changed the atmosphere around the house in a way that could not be reversed. It was no longer just tension between family members. It was procedure. It was documentation. It was consequence slowly tightening around everything my parents had tried to control. By the fourth day, I stopped seeing my father leave the house. He remained inside most of the time, moving between rooms like someone waiting for a verdict that had already been written but not yet announced. My mother, on the other hand, had become almost completely silent. Not calm silence, but withdrawn silence, the kind that comes when someone realizes speaking no longer changes outcomes. Late that morning, Marissa Hale informed me that the forensic audit team had officially begun tracing financial movement connected to the estate. She said the first confirmed findings had already matched irregular transfer patterns tied directly to accounts under my parents' names. The structure was more complex than expected, but the intention was now clear. The inheritance had not simply been redirected, it had been systematically broken into segments to avoid detection. She paused before adding something that shifted the emotional weight of everything again. She said there were signs that some of the transfers had been made shortly after my grandmother's death, but before any official reading of the will had taken place. That meant the redistribution was not reactive. It was pre-planned. I didn't respond immediately. It felt like the situation was no longer expanding outward. It was collapsing inward toward a single truth that had been hidden in layers of delay and silence. That evening, my father finally called me into the living room. He was sitting in the same chair he always used when making decisions for the family. But this time, the posture was different. Less authority, more exhaustion. My mother stood near the window, not looking at either of us. He told me we needed to resolve this privately before it went further. The way he said it made it sound like the situation was still negotiable, like we were still operating inside a system where his influence mattered. I asked him what exactly he meant by resolve. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something about family reputation, about misunderstandings becoming irreversible if pushed too far. His voice was controlled, but the control was no longer convincing. For the first time, I saw something beneath it. Not anger, not manipulation. Something closer to fear of exposure. I told him the legal process was already active and that private resolution was no longer an option. That was when he stood up slowly and said something I will not forget. He said I had opened something that could not be closed without damage. There was a long silence after that. The next morning, police officers arrived at the estate in a formal capacity. They were not there for confrontation. They were there for documentation and coordination with the financial investigation team. The presence alone changed everything inside the house. Doors that were once symbolic of privacy now felt meaningless. My mother finally spoke to me that day, but only once. She asked if I truly believed this was what my grandmother wanted. Her voice wasn't defensive. It was uncertain. like she was trying to understand whether the outcome had been avoidable. I told her I didn't think it was about what anyone wanted anymore. It was about what had already been set in motion long before I returned. That afternoon, Marissa requested that I come to her office again. This time, she had a complete file prepared. She placed it in front of me and said the investigation had reached a decisive stage. Every major transfer had now been traced. Every concealed account had been identified. And most importantly, the legal override clause was now fully validated. She said something I didn't expect. She said my grandmother had not only protected the inheritance, she had also structured accountability into it, meaning every attempt to alter the estate had created a traceable legal footprint that strengthened the reversal case. It was not just protection. It was self-documenting enforcement. I remember sitting there for a long time after she finished speaking. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was finally seeing the full shape of what had been happening. This was not a sudden conflict. It was a delayed outcome of something carefully designed to surface only when tested. When I returned home that evening, I noticed my father sitting alone in the dark living room. No television, no phone calls, just silence. He didn't look at me when I entered. After a while, he said something quietly. He said he didn't think it would reach this point, that he believed it could be contained within family boundaries. That statement revealed more than anything else he had said before. It showed the assumption that control was permanent, even when actions suggested otherwise. I didn't respond, because by then there was nothing left to negotiate. The next morning, an official notice arrived confirming full asset freeze enforcement across all associated accounts. The inheritance was now entirely under legal protection pending final reversal execution. My parents were required to submit final statements within 48 hours. When they received the notice, I saw something shift in both of them. Not panic, not outrage. Something more contained. Like realization that the structure they had relied on was no longer responding to them at all. My mother sat down at the kitchen table and didn't move for a long time. My father stood near the window, staring outside, as if distance could still provide escape. That was the first moment I understood something clearly. They were no longer trying to win. They were trying to understand how they had already lost without noticing the exact moment it happened. And somewhere inside all of this, I kept thinking about my grandmother. Not as a memory, but as a design. Because nothing unfolding now felt accidental anymore. By the time the final phase of the investigation began, the house no longer felt like it belonged to anyone. It had become a place where decisions made elsewhere were simply being delivered and observed. Even the air felt heavier, as if it understood that something irreversible was approaching its conclusion. 48 hours after the final notice, Marissa Hale called me early in the morning. Her voice carried a different tone this time, measured, final, precise. She told me the forensic audit had been completed and submitted for judicial review. Every concealed transfer, every redirected account, every incomplete filing had been verified and compiled into a single legal record. Then she paused before adding the part that made everything settle into place. She said the court had accepted preliminary validation of the inheritance override clause. That meant the reversal process was no longer theoretical. It was active. When I hung up, I didn't feel excitement or relief. It felt more like standing at the edge of something that had already finished happening in principle, but had not yet fully reached the surface in reality. That morning, my father was not in the kitchen. Instead, I found him in the study, sitting in front of the locked drawer that had once held the hidden documents. It was open now, empty. He was staring at it like it still contained answers that were supposed to change the outcome. My mother stood behind him, holding a folded sheet of paper in her hand. It was the same official notice, but now marked with court confirmation stamps. Her fingers were tight around it, as if holding it harder could alter what it meant. Neither of them spoke when I entered. After a long silence, my father finally said my grandmother had engineered destruction inside the family. The words were sharp, but they carried something else underneath. Not accusation anymore. Recognition. I sat down opposite them, not because I wanted to, but because standing felt unnecessary at that point. I told them this wasn't destruction. It was consequence. That distinction mattered more than anything else now. My mother looked at me for the first time in days and asked a question that didn't sound rehearsed. She asked if I had known this would happen when I came back. I told her no. I said I only knew something was wrong. The rest unfolded on its own. And that was the truth, because what none of them seemed to fully understand yet was that I had not controlled any part of the system that was now collapsing around them. I had only activated something that had been waiting far longer than I had been alive. That afternoon, legal representatives arrived again, this time accompanied by court-appointed enforcement officers. They were there to initiate asset restoration procedures and verify final compliance before execution of reversal orders. The house filled quickly with movement. Not chaos, but structured action. Files were reviewed, statements were recorded, devices were examined. Everything that once felt private was now part of a formal record. My father remained seated in the study for most of it. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. That was the most noticeable change, the absence of resistance. My mother stayed in the hallway, watching as documents were carried in and out of rooms that had once held family conversations instead of legal procedures. At one point, she turned toward me and said softly that she never thought it would reach this level. Her voice carried something unfamiliar, regret that had no direction to go. I didn't respond immediately because I understood something she didn't yet fully accept. This wasn't escalation. It was completion. Later that evening, Marissa arrived in person. She brought the final authorization file with her. She placed it on the table in front of all of us and explained that the court had approved full execution of the inheritance reversal under the terms established by my grandmother's clause. She looked at me directly and said that I would need to sign the final acknowledgement to activate distribution correction. My hands were steady when I signed, but something inside me paused for a moment before the ink settled. Not hesitation, awareness. Because that signature didn't create justice. It only finalized what had already been determined through evidence, structure, and time. When everything was complete, enforcement officers confirmed that all assets previously distributed through unauthorized channels had been legally reversed. Accounts were frozen and redirected. Ownership records were corrected. Every trace of manipulation was formally nullified. My father stood up slowly after the confirmation was read aloud. He looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "She planned for us to fail." There was no anger in his voice anymore, only understanding. My mother sat down in the chair behind her like her strength had been quietly removed instead of taken away. She didn't speak after that. The officers finished their procedures and left the house in stages, leaving behind an unusual kind of silence. Not empty silence, but resolved silence. The kind that follows the end of a process that required everything to be seen before it could conclude. That night, I stayed in the living room alone for a long time. The house felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the structure of control that once defined it no longer existed. I thought about my grandmother again, not as a memory this time, but as intention. Every decision she made, every clause she wrote, every delay she anticipated, it all pointed toward one idea. She didn't just leave behind inheritance. She left behind correction. And it only activated when someone tried to rewrite what she had already decided to protect. At some point during the night, my mother came and sat across from me. She didn't ask questions. She didn't defend anything. She just said she didn't understand how something so final could have been hidden in plain sight for so long. I told her it wasn't hidden, it was ignored. That was the difference. Because truth doesn't need to hide when people assume they already control the outcome. It only needs patience. It felt prepared. The days that followed the execution of the inheritance reversal did not feel like resolution immediately. They felt like aftermath, not of an event that had ended suddenly, but of something that had been quietly unraveling long before anyone acknowledged it. The house was no longer under legal tension, but it still carried emotional residue. My father had stopped making phone calls altogether. My mother moved through daily routines with no urgency, as if time had lost its structure. There was no more negotiation, no more strategy, only adjustment. 3 days after the final court confirmation, Marissa Hale asked me to come in once more. This time, the meeting was not about procedure. It was about closure of documentation and final legal confirmation of asset restoration. When I arrived, she handed me a sealed summary file. Inside were the complete findings of the investigation, including a detailed timeline of every financial movement, every concealed transfer, and every attempt to restructure the inheritance before and after my grandmother's passing. She didn't read it aloud. She simply placed it in front of me and said everything had been verified beyond dispute. But then she added something unexpected. She said my grandmother's planning had extended beyond protection and reversal. There were ethical instructions embedded within the legal structure, guidelines for what should happen after resolution. That caught my attention. I opened the last section of the file and found something written in my grandmother's handwriting again. Not legal language this time. Personal instruction. It stated that if the inheritance was ever subjected to manipulation and later restored, a portion of the estate was to be redirected toward causes connected to financial abuse recovery and legal education support. It wasn't punishment. It was redirection. A system designed not only to correct wrongdoing, but to create prevention beyond it. When I left Marissa's office, I didn't go home immediately. I sat in my car for a long time, thinking about the structure of what had just unfolded. Everything my grandmother had built wasn't reactive. It was layered anticipation. She hadn't just expected betrayal. She had designed the consequences of it to extend beyond individuals. That evening, when I returned to the house, my father was outside in the garden. He was standing near the same place where we used to have family dinners years ago. But now the space felt different, as if it remembered a version of itself that no longer existed. He didn't turn immediately when I approached. When he finally did, his expression was no longer defensive or controlled. It was quiet in a way I had never seen before. He said he had spent the last few days thinking about how easily certainty can become assumption, how belief in control can replace awareness of consequences. I didn't respond right away, because there was nothing to correct in what he said, only something to acknowledge. My mother joined us a few minutes later. She stood slightly apart from both of us, not intervening, not avoiding, just present. For the first time in a long time, there was no structure between us. No legal process, no documentation, no hidden files shaping every sentence. Only the result of what had already been decided. Later that night, I went to my room and opened a small box I had kept with me since returning home. Inside was the sealed envelope from my grandmother that had started everything. I hadn't needed to keep it anymore, legally speaking, but I hadn't been able to let it go either. I held it for a long time before placing it on the desk, and I realized something that had not been clear before. The inheritance was never the point. It was the test. Not for me alone, but for everyone who believed control could exist without accountability. The next morning, I received one final message from Marissa. It contained confirmation that all legal proceedings had been fully closed. No further actions were pending. The estate had been fully restored and redistributed according to final authorized directives. There would be no further hearings, no further reversals, no further uncertainty. That afternoon, I went back to the garden where my father had been the day before. He was not there this time. Instead, I found my mother sitting alone on the bench. She looked up when I approached, but didn't speak immediately. After a long pause, she said something quietly that stayed with me. She said she kept thinking about how differently everything might have unfolded if honesty had existed earlier, even in small amounts. I told her honesty doesn't delay outcomes forever. It only changes how painful they become when they arrive. She nodded, but didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue about. By the end of the week, I began preparing to leave the house again. Not because I was escaping anything, but because nothing here required me to stay anymore. The structure that had once pulled me back into its center had already dissolved. Before leaving, I walked through each room one last time. Not to remember what had happened, but to recognize what no longer controlled it. When I reached the doorway, my father stood behind me. He didn't try to stop me. He only said he hoped I understood something important. I asked what. He said that consequences don't always feel like justice to everyone involved. I told him I understood that already, because justice was never designed to feel the same for everyone. It was designed to reveal what was already true. And then I left. 6 months passed in a way that didn't feel dramatic or marked by clear transitions. It felt more like distance slowly being added between who I was when everything happened and who I was becoming afterward. Life didn't reset. It simply continued, but without the weight that once defined every decision. I moved to a different city within the first month, not out of escape, but because staying in the same environment would have made it harder to separate memory from direction. The new place was small, quiet, and ordinary in a way that felt stabilizing. I didn't try to rebuild anything from before. I started with what was necessary, and nothing more. Work came gradually, routine returned slowly, and for the first time in a long while, silence stopped feeling like tension and started feeling like space. I didn't speak to my parents for several weeks after leaving. There was no conflict that needed resolution, no unfinished argument waiting for closure. Everything that needed to be said had already been expressed through action, documentation, and consequence. When contact finally came, it wasn't planned. My mother called one evening. I almost didn't answer, but something about the timing made me pick up. Her voice was different. Not broken, not emotional in an overwhelming way, just quieter, as if she had learned to reduce herself to what was necessary. She told me things had stabilized legally and financially. The estate process was fully closed, and there were no remaining disputes. She didn't mention the past directly. Neither did I. But after a pause, she said something that stayed with me. She said she had been thinking a lot about my grandmother lately, about how she always seemed to know things before they happened, even when she never said them out loud. I told her some people don't predict the future. They simply understand patterns well enough to recognize what hasn't changed in others. She didn't respond immediately. Then she said she wished she had understood those patterns earlier. After that, the conversation ended naturally, without tension or emotional collapse. Just distance, acknowledging itself. I didn't hear from my father during that period. Months later, I received a letter. Not an email or message, but an actual written letter. His handwriting was slower than I remembered, less controlled. He didn't try to justify anything. He didn't revisit the legal process or argue outcomes. Instead, he wrote about reflection, about how control can sometimes feel like protection until it is tested against something that was designed without ego. There was one line that stood out more than the rest. He wrote that he had mistaken access for ownership. And that realization, he said, had taken longer to understand than the reversal itself. I kept the letter without responding, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because some acknowledgments don't require continuation. Around the same time, I visited Marissa Hale one last time. This meeting was informal. She said there was nothing left to process legally, but she wanted to hand me something connected to the final instructions my grandmother had left. It was a sealed appendix that had not been included in the main proceedings. When I opened it, I found a short personal note addressed directly to me. It did not mention inheritance, money, or legal structures. It said something simple. That responsibility is not always about carrying weight for others, but about ensuring systems remain intact when people forget why they exist. And then, one final line. It said I was never meant to inherit only property. I was meant to inherit clarity. After reading it, I sat in silence for a long time. Because for the first time, I understood that everything I had experienced was not just a response to betrayal. It was an initiation into understanding how easily systems built on trust can be altered when assumption replaces accountability. Not just in families, but anywhere. Work continued to stabilize over time. I didn't pursue anything related to law or estates. My life became smaller in structure but clearer in direction. I focused on things that didn't require reconstruction or recovery, things that existed without needing to be repaired first. Sometimes, in quieter moments, I still thought about the house. Not as a place of conflict, but as a place where everything had already been decided long before I understood how decisions were being made. I thought about my grandmother less as a figure of memory and more as a framework. Someone who understood that truth doesn't always need to be defended loudly. Sometimes it only needs to be positioned correctly, so that when pressure is applied, it reveals itself without resistance. One evening, nearly a year after everything had concluded, I found myself walking near a quiet street lined with trees. Nothing about the moment felt significant on the surface, but I realized I wasn't thinking about what had happened anymore. Not actively. That was new. The weight had shifted from experience into understanding. And understanding doesn't demand attention the same way pain does. It simply exists. Before returning home that night, I stopped for a moment and looked at the sky. There was nothing symbolic about it. No dramatic realization, no emotional surge. Just a simple awareness that some events in life are not meant to be revisited repeatedly. They are meant to be integrated. So they no longer define you. They inform you. Another year passed, and life stopped feeling like something that had been taken apart and rebuilt. It started feeling like something that had simply moved forward without asking permission. I stopped measuring time by what had happened before and after the inheritance case. That chapter no longer defined the edges of my days. It only existed as something I could look back at without being pulled back into it. There were moments, of course, when memory surfaced without invitation. Not emotional collapse, not regret, just recognition. Like passing by a closed building you once lived in and realizing the lights are no longer yours to switch on. I didn't return to the house again. There was no need. It had already been reduced to what it truly was, a place where intentions had been revealed under pressure. My grandmother's influence, however, did not fade in the way people assume memory fades. It remained present, but not as grief. More like structure. I began noticing how often people misunderstand silence, how often they confuse delay with absence, or compliance with surrender. And I realized that most of what had protected me was not strength in the moment, but preparation long before the moment arrived. One afternoon, I received a small parcel with no return address. Inside was a single item, a handwritten copy of the final clause I had once signed. But beneath it, something new had been added. A note, not from my grandmother this time, but from the Legal Archive Office, confirming permanent closure of the estate case. It stated that all conditions had been executed in full accordance with the original instructions, and no further claims or disputes could be made. There was finality in that sentence that didn't feel emotional. It felt administrative, and somehow that made it stronger. That evening, I sat by the window of my apartment and thought about how strange it was that the most emotionally intense period of my life had ended in paperwork, signatures, and procedural language. No dramatic confrontation had ever truly mattered. Only structure did. Only proof did. Only timing did. And only patience did. I thought about my parents then, not as adversaries or figures in a conflict, but as people who had misread a system they assumed they understood. I didn't feel victory in the traditional sense. There was no celebration inside me, just clarity. Because what I had learned was not that truth always wins. It's that truth does not need urgency to survive. It only needs preservation. And when I finally stopped replaying everything in my mind, I noticed something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness without tension. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of completion. Before going to bed that night, I opened a drawer where I kept a few remaining personal items from that period of my life. The sealed envelope from my grandmother was still there, though I had long since memorized its contents. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. Instead, I placed it back and closed the drawer, not as an ending, but as acknowledgement that nothing inside it required further action. And for the first time since everything began, I understood something simple and final. Not every inheritance is about what you receive. Some inheritances are about what you are finally able to see clearly when everything else is taken away. And once you see it, you don't unsee it. You just move forward with it.